Well, as best I can tell, oh, I like having my little free prop here. As best I can tell, I was invited to moderate this panel because several years ago I became absolutely obsessed with trying to understand what really happens to people and to a perfectly ordinary community when good jobs go away. This obsession began to take root during the Great Recession a little bit afterwards. I was at the time covering a very broad social policy beat for the Post, and I did a few stories about how this bad economic time affected people's lives. And one story in particular that really got to me was a story I did in Southwest Florida, in which I was at a welfare office hanging out with people who were falling out of the middle class and onto the welfare rolls, and were just astonished that this was happening to them. And over the next year or two, I began to pay attention to the kind of writing that journalism colleagues of mine were doing about the bad economy. And they seemed to fall into two camps. One set of stories was about the government's economic policies, was then early in the Obama administration, and political disputes over whether these policies were being helpful or not. And then during the midterm election of 2010, I began to see a lot of stories, I'm sure you all remember this, about voter anger and voter anxiety, which may seem mild compared to what we saw in this most recent election cycle. But even then, there was this bubbling up of talk and of journalism about people being anxious about their role in this country and their role in their communities. And what struck me when I was reading all this other good journalism was that I didn't see very much writing that was putting these two things together. And I began to think that you really couldn't understand why Americans were angry or anxious unless you understood their personal economic experiences, jobs that they were losing, jobs their neighbors were losing, fears that their jobs might be the next one to go. And during that time, I came across a Pew study that had analyzed it, like a little content analysis of 10,000 news stories that were written the first half of 2009, which was the latter part of the official time of the Great Recession, and categorizing what they were about. And most of the stories were about the government bailout, about banks, about the auto industry. Of these 10,000 stories, how many were about average Americans? 5%. Well, this struck me as a huge and important gap, that we all knew what the unemployment statistics were like, but we weren't really reading about what it was like for people to lose work. So I became this kind of one-woman obsessional person who took 2 years off of my job at the Post to begin to do some research on this. And I had the idea that I wanted to focus on one community as kind of a metaphor or microcosm of what was going on in many communities across the country. And if we have any time left, which we may not, we can talk about why I picked Janesville. I picked it not just because it was Paul Ryan's hometown. He wasn't even a committee chair at the time, let alone the House Speaker. But the main reason I picked it was because it had been the home of what was General Motors' oldest operating General Assembly plant. I didn't say that right, General Motors Assembly Plant, that had started out making tractors in 1919 and began turning out Chevys in 1923. So it had been the best working class work in town for generation after generation. It was sort of what extended families did for a living. And 2 days before Christmas of 2008, right in the middle of the Great Recession, it closed. And Janesville and the county that it's in that year in 2009, those 2 years, lost about 9,000 jobs. So when Senator Casey was talking about criteria for getting help from his bill of 250 jobs, these were 9 jobs in this little area of southern Wisconsin. And I'm a pretty nerdy journalist at heart, so I did some quantitative parts of this book. I did a survey that was similar to some of the questions that Senator Casey was talking about in the Federal Reserve analysis about what it did to people to lose work and how many people had lost work in this area. It turned out that 1 in 3 families had somebody in which their had lost a job in their household. I did a little statistical analysis with help of some labor economists of the effectiveness or lack thereof of job training. But the heart of this book was really the stories about the people who were affected. So I'm just going to very quickly tell you a little about the 3 main auto worker families who are at the core of this book. One family is called the Vaughns, and they're a big union family in Janesville. They're one of 2 families in town that had had 3 generations of men on the executive committee of United Auto Workers Local 95, which is the UAW local in Janesville. And Mike Vaughn had been the shop chairman at the biggest supplier to the GM plant. It was a seat-making plant called Lear, had 800 people. And when all those jobs went away, including Mike's, he tried to find union jobs and just couldn't find anything that made sense to him. So he thought about what to do. He's a pretty thoughtful guy. Thought about what his union experience would translate into, and he decided to retrain in human resources management. Well, if you think about the last word there, management, that was a pretty hard pill to swallow. And he came to think that he would still be doing good helping workers from the management side, but there's a scene in the story where Mike has to get up his nerve to tell his father, who was also a union leader, and think about what effect it would have on his father's sense of what this family was becoming. Another family are the Wopats. Matt Wopat had worked at the GM plant for 13 years when he lost his job. His father had worked at the plant for 40 years and just retired on this very nice pension, and had this big retirement party knowing that his son was about to lose his job a couple weeks later. And over a couple of years, Matt's also struggling to figure out what to do, and he ends up becoming something called a GM gypsy, which meant that if you worked at General Motors itself, unlike at some of the supplier companies, you had transfer rights. So Matt ended up deciding to commute to Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is about 300 miles away. And he leaves every Monday morning, comes back late at night on Fridays. He works second shift, which means that he can spend sort of 2.5 nights at home every weekend before he makes that commute back again. And like a lot of people in town, Matt and his family don't want to leave Janesville. I mean, they're really anchored there. So there are all these General Motors who are commuting far. Fort Wayne, Indiana is the closest place you can be commuting with these GM gypsy jobs. Final family is the Whitakers. Jared Whitaker had also worked for 13 years at the General Motors plant in Janesville, and he didn't want to transfer. He didn't want to be away from his family. So he ends up eventually starting a whole series of bad paid jobs. He eventually decides to take a General Motors buyout. That was a really crummy buyout. It was just a couple $1,000s. But the reason he took it was at the time he was working a low-wage job that didn't have health benefits. And this buyout gave him 6 more months of health benefits for his wife and 3 kids. And the people I first got to know in this family were his twin daughters who were in high school. Their dad was working, their mom was working 2 bad pay part-time jobs. And these girls who were really smart kids, they were really good AP students, their teachers all loved them, they started working 5 part-time jobs between them and eventually started helping the family pay grocery bills and pay for utilities. So we're going to pivot now to everybody else who's sitting up here waiting their turn to speak. But I just want to tell you a little bit about these families that I've gotten to know in Janesville as a way of thinking as we're talking about policy and about ideas and about theory. I mean, these are people's lives who are at stake, so I just wanted to keep that in mind.